Right now, beneath the ocean floor off the coast of Oregon and Washington, two of the Earth's largest tectonic plates are locked together in a grip that has been building pressure for over 3 centuries, and geologists are increasingly worried about what happens when that grip finally lets go. In September 2022, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network recorded an unusual cluster of low-frequency tremors rippling through the deep crust beneath the Olympic Peninsula. Not the kind of tremors that make headlines, not the kind that rattle windows or knock pictures off walls. These were quieter, stranger, what seismologists call episodic tremor and slip events, essentially the fault whispering. And what makes those whispers alarming isn't the tremors themselves, it's what they indicate is building underneath them. The Cascadia Subduction Zone, a 700-mile-long fault system stretching from northern California all the way to southern British Columbia, has not produced a full margin rupture since January 26, 1700. That's 324 years of accumulated stress. 324 years of two tectonic plates grinding against each other, locking tighter, building elastic energy that has nowhere to go except, eventually, everywhere at once. Geological evidence suggests this fault produces magnitude 9.0 or greater earthquakes on a roughly 200 to 500-year cycle. We are, by any reasonable interpretation of that data, in the window. Some researchers would argue we've been deep inside that window for decades. So the question isn't really whether Cascadia will rupture again. The scientific consensus is clear that it will. The question, the one that should be driving urgent policy conversations up and down the Pacific coast, is whether the 10 million people living in its impact zone will be ready when it does. To understand why the Cascadia Subduction Zone keeps scientists up at night, you have to understand the sheer scale of what we're dealing with, because this is not a fault line in the traditional sense most people picture. When most people think of dangerous fault systems, they think of the San Andreas in California, and the San Andreas is genuinely dangerous, a strike-slip fault where two plates grind horizontally past each other, capable of devastating earthquakes. But Cascadia operates on a fundamentally different and, in many ways, more alarming mechanism. This is a subduction zone. That means the Juan de Fuca plate, a dense oceanic plate sitting in the Pacific, is actively diving underneath the North American plate at roughly 40 millimeters per year. That's about the rate your fingernails grow. Slow, relentless, and building towards something enormous. The zone runs from Cape Mendocino in Northern California, up through the Oregon and Washington coasts, past the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and into British Columbia. 700 miles. For scale, that's roughly the driving distance from Los Angeles to San Francisco, twice. When a fault this long ruptures simultaneously along its full length, the energy release isn't just large, it's civilizational in scale. And this fault sits just offshore from some of the most populated, most economically significant cities on the west coast of North America. Portland, Oregon, population 2.5 million in the metro area, sits roughly 70 miles inland from the subduction interface. Seattle, Washington, home to the headquarters of Amazon, Boeing, Microsoft, and a metro population approaching 4 million, sits on a complex network of secondary faults that would be violently activated by a full Cascadia rupture. Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada's third-largest city, lies well within the projected impact zone. And then there's the coast itself, the towns of Seaside and Cannon Beach in Oregon, Aberdeen in Washington, Crescent City in California, communities sitting essentially on top of the tsunami inundation zones that FEMA and USGS models project would be catastrophically flooded within 15 to 30 minutes of a full rupture. What makes Cascadia particularly striking as a geological threat is how thoroughly it was ignored, or more accurately, not yet understood, until relatively recently. As late as the 1980s, many geologists believed the Cascadia zone was what they called aseismic, meaning it was slipping quietly and wasn't storing dangerous amounts of stress. That assumption turned out to be catastrophically wrong. And the story of how scientists figured that out is genuinely one of the more unsettling scientific reversals in modern geological history. There's also the question of infrastructure. The Pacific Northwest is home to hundreds of unreinforced masonry buildings, older brick structures that perform catastrophically in major earthquakes. The region's bridges, many of which were designed and built before modern seismic standards, sit atop the same soft, liquefiable soils that amplify ground shaking. Water and gas lines run beneath cities in materials that cannot survive the lateral movement a M9.0 plus event would produce. Oregon's own resilience plan, published in 2013, described a Cascadia rupture as potentially leaving the state dysfunctional for months to years. That's the official state government's own assessment. Here's what's actually happening hundreds of miles beneath your feet if you live anywhere between Northern California and British Columbia, and why the physics involved are so alarming to the researchers who study them. The Juan de Fuca plate and the North American plate aren't sliding past each other smoothly. If they were, the energy would release gradually in thousands of small earthquakes, and the big one would never come. Instead, they're locked. The interface between them, the actual fault surface, is behaving like a stuck zipper held together by friction while the plates continue trying to move. The North American plate above the locked zone is being slowly deformed. Its leading edge is being dragged downward and compressed, building what geophysicists call elastic strain energy. Think of it like bending a thick steel rod. You can bend it quite far, store enormous mechanical energy in the deformation, and then, past a critical threshold, it doesn't bend anymore. It snaps. That snap, in geological terms, is the earthquake. When the Cascadia fault finally unlocks, the motion won't be gentle or gradual. Based on modeling of comparable subduction events, the interface could slip 50 to 100 feet in a matter of minutes. Not 50 feet over a year, not 50 feet over a century, 50 to 100 feet in 2 to 5 minutes. The ground shaking produced by that kind of sudden, massive displacement would be sustained. Not the brief, sharp jolt of a smaller earthquake, but potentially 3 to 5 minutes of intense, continuous ground motion across a 700-mile stretch. University of Oregon geophysicist Dr. Chris Goldfinger, one of the leading researchers on Cascadia's rupture history, has described the fault as storing energy like a giant spring. His team's work, published in the Bulletin of the Seismological Society of America, analyzed turbidite deposits, underwater landslide layers triggered by past earthquakes, to reconstruct thousands of years of Cascadia's rupture history. What they found was a pattern of full-margin ruptures occurring roughly every 200 to 530 years in the southern section, with the northern segment, the section nearest Seattle and Vancouver, rupturing on a somewhat different and potentially independent cycle. That last point matters enormously. It means there may be scenarios where only the southern section of the fault ruptures, a partial rupture that would still produce a magnitude 8.0 to 8.5 earthquake and a significant tsunami, or scenarios where the entire 700-mile margin fails simultaneously, producing what models suggest could reach M9.2 or higher. For context, the difference between a M8.5 and a M9.2 isn't a small step. Because earthquake magnitude scales logarithmically, a M9.2 releases roughly 16 times more energy than a M8.5. 16 times more energy, released through the same geological system, into the same cities. The USGS Cascadia Monitoring Program, in coordination with the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network and the Geological Survey of Canada, maintains a dense network of GPS stations, seismometers, and offshore pressure sensors specifically designed to track Cascadia's behavior. What those instruments have documented over recent decades is a fault that is, in scientific terminology, fully coupled in its northern portions, meaning almost none of the ongoing tectonic motion is being released through small earthquakes. The plates are locked tight. Every millimeter of motion that doesn't release quietly is motion that gets stored. And after 324 years of storage, the debt is extraordinary. There's also the matter of the episodic tremor and slip events mentioned earlier, the slow-motion fault movements that occur every 12 to 15 months in the deep portion of the subduction zone. Research published by the Geological Survey of Canada found that each ETS episode is, in effect, transferring stress upward, loading the locked, shallower portion of the fault more rapidly than would otherwise occur. Scientists at the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network have described these episodes as evidence that the system is not static. It's dynamic, it's active, and it's loading. You might be wondering, if all this monitoring exists, why don't we have a better warning system? That's exactly the right question, and we'll get to the uncomfortable answer in a few minutes. We know, with extraordinary precision, when the Cascadia fault last ruptured, and the story of how scientists figured that out is one of the most remarkable pieces of geological detective work in modern history. On January 26, 1700, at approximately 9 p.m. Pacific Time, the entire Cascadia Subduction Zone ruptured in what geologists now estimate was a M9.0 to M9.2 earthquake. We know this with such precision, not because anyone in the Pacific Northwest recorded it. The indigenous peoples of the region had oral traditions that referenced a great shaking and flooding, but there were no written records. We know the date because of Japan. Across the Pacific, Japanese coastal villages recorded a orphan tsunami, a tsunami that arrived with no earthquake that the locals had felt. They recorded the flooding in meticulous detail, the date, the height of the water, which villages were struck. Japanese historian Kenji Satake and a team of researchers worked backward from those historical records, calculating the ocean travel time of a Pacific tsunami, and narrowed the source to the Cascadia coast on that specific January night. They then confirmed it by cross-referencing with tree ring data from coastal Oregon ghost forests, stands of red cedar and Sitka spruce that were killed when the coastal land subsided 3 to 6 feet during the rupture, drowning their roots in salt water. The trees stopped growing in 1699 or early 1700, precise, independent confirmation from two entirely separate data sources, separated by an ocean. What happened in those hours is worth understanding in detail, because it's the closest analog we have for what a future Cascadia rupture would look like, just stripped of the modern cities, highways, and infrastructure that now fill the impact zone. The shaking lasted between 3 and 5 minutes. 3 to 5 minutes. For context, the 1994 Northridge earthquake that caused catastrophic damage in Los Angeles lasted approximately 10 to 20 seconds. The 1906 San Francisco earthquake lasted under a minute. Cascadia, in 1700, shook for several minutes, long enough to collapse virtually any structure that couldn't survive sustained, intense ground motion. The coastal land subsided, dropped, by as much as 6 feet along stretches of the Oregon and Washington coast. This sudden permanent lowering of the land surface is a signature of subduction zone megaquakes and has been confirmed at dozens of coastal archaeological and geological sites. In some locations, researchers have found layers of buried marsh soil, what they call a drowned forest horizon, showing exactly where the land surface was before the quake dropped it below the tidal zone. Then the tsunami came. Within 15 to 30 minutes of the main shock, the ocean pulled back, the characteristic warning retreat, and then returned as a series of waves. In 1700, much of the coastal zone was lightly populated. The damage was real, but the human death toll was limited by sparse settlement. Imagine that same shoreline today. The town of Seaside, Oregon, population 7,000, sitting at sea level at the mouth of the Nicanacum River, has an estimated evacuation time, on foot to high ground, of approximately 20 minutes. The tsunami could arrive in 15. That gap, that 5-minute window, appears in emergency management documents, in FEMA planning scenarios, in state resilience reports. It has appeared for years, and the town still sits there, full of residents and tourists, because the earthquake has not come during any of the decades those documents have been written. The Pacific Northwest's indigenous nations, the Tillamook, the Quinault, the Maka, and others, carried oral traditions describing exactly what 1700 looked like from the ground. Stories of the land shaking and the sea rising, of villages swallowed, of survivors who had fled to higher ground. For generations, these accounts were treated by some Western researchers as myth or exaggeration. When the geological evidence was finally assembled in the 1980s and 1990s, it confirmed those oral histories with startling accuracy. The stories weren't mythology. They were eyewitness accounts, passed down across centuries. The Pacific Northwest is blanketed in one of the most sophisticated seismic monitoring networks on Earth, and what those instruments have been recording over the past decade has quietly elevated concern among researchers. The Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, operated jointly by the University of Washington and the University of Oregon, maintains over 800 seismic stations across the region. The Ocean Observatory's initiative has deployed seafloor sensors directly on the Cascadia Fault interface, feeding real-time data to researchers. GPS ground deformation networks track the millimeter-scale bending of the North American plate as it's dragged by the locked fault beneath it. And NOAA's DART buoy network, Deep Ocean Assessment and Reporting of Tsunamis, dots the Pacific, designed to detect tsunamis in the open ocean and provide coastal communities with warning time. But here's where the monitoring picture gets complicated. And this is something that doesn't get nearly enough public attention. The Pacific Northwest's early warning system for earthquakes, Shake Alert, was formally activated for public alerts in Washington and Oregon in 2021. It is a genuine technological achievement. Under ideal conditions, it can provide 10 to 60 seconds of warning before strong ground shaking reaches a given location. For a moderate earthquake with a distant epicenter, that could be enough time to drop, cover, and hold on. For a Cascadia full margin rupture, which would originate just 50 to 100 miles offshore, the warning time for coastal communities could be under 30 seconds. In some locations, essentially zero. This doesn't mean the system is useless. Shake Alert could still trigger automated responses, slow trains, open fire station doors, halt surgical equipment. But it means that for the millions of people in the Pacific Northwest, the warning system will not provide enough time to do much more than react. The earthquake itself is the warning. The tsunami warning picture is somewhat better, but not uniformly so. NOAA's tsunami warning centers can issue alerts within a few minutes of detecting a major offshore earthquake, potentially giving inland communities and northern coastal zones 30 to 60 minutes of advance notice. But the communities closest to the fault, the beaches, the river mouths, the low-lying coastal towns, sit within the 15 to 30-minute inundation window that predates any formal alert. What researchers have been watching with particular interest are the patterns of episodic tremor and slip events. Those slow slip episodes that have been documented occurring with increasing regularity and in some cases increasing energy release. A 2023 paper from researchers at the University of Victoria found that recent ETS episodes beneath southern Vancouver Island had involved deeper fault segments than in previous recorded cycles, suggesting the stress loading may be advancing into previously unaffected portions of the interface. That's not proof of imminent rupture. Scientists are careful about that, and appropriately so. But it is the kind of anomaly that goes into the files, the ones that get reviewed after events, not before. FEMA's most comprehensive modeling of a Cascadia full rupture scenario, part of the Cascadia Rising exercise series, projected over 13,000 deaths, 27,000 injuries, and the displacement of over 1 million people in the immediate aftermath. Infrastructure losses were projected in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and those projections assumed a rupture during daylight hours, with residents awake, aware, capable of responding. A nighttime rupture, when coastal tourists fill hotels at sea level, and residents are asleep, would likely produce substantially higher casualty numbers. Preparedness infrastructure in the region has improved meaningfully in recent years. Oregon has invested in vertical evacuation structures, reinforced towers on the coast where people can climb above tsunami inundation zones. Washington has updated its building codes and is in the process of retrofitting older infrastructure. But the gap between current readiness and what a M9.2 event would demand remains, in the words of multiple researchers, significant. Scientists can't tell us when the Cascadia fault will rupture, and that uncertainty is real, not a hedge, but they have spent decades building models of exactly what the first hours and days would look like, and those models are worth sitting with. In the first seconds after a full Cascadia rupture, every seismograph in the Pacific Northwest spikes simultaneously. Shake Alert fires. Automated systems across the region begin triggering, and then the shaking begins. Not the sharp, punchy jolt of a local earthquake, but a rolling, sustained, escalating movement that builds over the first 30 seconds and then sustains for 2 to 4 minutes. The ground doesn't just shake, it moves. GPS data from analogous subduction ruptures, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake in Japan, the 2010 Mal earthquake in Chile, showed that the land surface itself shifted laterally by feet, not inches, as centuries of elastic deformation released in a matter of minutes. In Portland, 70 miles inland, ground shaking would still likely reach modified Mercalli intensity levels of 8 to 9, described as severe to violent. At those intensities, poorly built structures collapse. Brick facades fall, bridges fail, underground utilities rupture. The city of Portland sits on a thick layer of soft sediment deposited by ancient floods. Sediment that, under intense shaking, can undergo liquefaction, essentially transforming from solid ground into something behaving more like a liquid. Buildings don't just shake, they sink, they tilt, they become uninhabitable in minutes. In Seattle, the situation is complicated by the presence of the Seattle Fault. an independent fault system running directly beneath the city that could be activated by the stress transfer from a Cascadia rupture. Stress transfer is exactly what it sounds like. Energy released on one fault shifts the stress distribution on nearby faults, potentially pushing them closer to their own failure thresholds. Models suggest a Cascadia rupture could increase the probability of a major Seattle fault event in the following weeks and months. Not certainly, not inevitably, but measurably. On the coast, in Seaside, in Lincoln City, in Westport, in Tofino, the ground shaking would be felt as the warning to move. Anyone who knows the science would be running for high ground before the shaking stopped. Anyone who didn't would potentially still be looking around, confused, trying to understand what happened when the ocean pulled back. The tsunami modeling for a full Cascadia rupture is staggering in its scope. NOAA projections suggest waves potentially reaching 30 to 100 feet in height in coastal coves and inlets where wave energy focuses. The inundation zone along the Oregon coast in some areas extends more than a mile inland. The tsunami would not be a single wave, it would be a series of waves, with subsequent crests potentially arriving every 10 to 30 minutes for hours. The first wave, as history repeatedly shows, is not necessarily the largest. Cascading infrastructure failures would define the days and weeks following. Interstate 5, the primary highway spine of the Pacific Northwest, crosses dozens of bridges rated as seismically vulnerable. The region's ports, Seattle, Tacoma, Portland, handle an enormous percentage of U.S. trade with Asia. Their disruption would ripple through national supply chains within days. Power grids serving millions of homes and businesses could be offline for weeks in damaged areas. Water systems, hospitals, emergency response networks, all of them dependent on infrastructure that would be deeply compromised. And the natural environment would bear its own scars. Landslides triggered by sustained shaking could block river valleys, create temporary dams, flood communities miles from the coast. Coastal erosion would be dramatically accelerated. In some areas, the land surface itself would be permanently altered, lower, more flood-prone, reshaped by the release of centuries of stored deformation. This is not a worst-case fever dream cooked up to generate views. These are the outputs of FEMA's own modeling exercises, peer-reviewed in scientific literature, presented to state legislatures, and acknowledged by the emergency managers whose job it is to plan for exactly this scenario. Here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Not panic, not despair, but clarity. Because understanding a threat is genuinely the first step toward being able to survive it. The Cascadia Subduction Zone is not a geological secret. It is one of the most studied fault systems in the world. The science is solid, the history is documented, the monitoring is real and ongoing. The uncomfortable part is simply that knowing something is coming and knowing when it's coming are two entirely different things. And this fault, like most geological systems, doesn't work on human schedules. What you can do with this information is practical, not performative. If you live in the Pacific Northwest or are visiting it, it costs nothing to know your tsunami zone. Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia all publish detailed inundation maps, and they're available free online. It costs nothing to know your nearest high ground and roughly how long it would take you to get there on foot. Emergency preparedness organizations recommend a 72-hour emergency kit. Water, food, medications, documents. Not because a megaquake is coming tomorrow, but because preparedness is the only rational response to living in a geologically active region. What should also be taken from this is a broader conversation about public investment. The retrofitting programs, the vertical evacuation structures, the bridge hardening projects, these are not luxury expenditures. They are rational responses to a geological reality that the science has made abundantly clear. The 1700 earthquake didn't know it was supposed to wait for better infrastructure. The next one won't either. There's something worth acknowledging here too. The indigenous communities of the Pacific Northwest coast carried knowledge of this fault's danger for centuries. In their stories, their village placement decisions, their oral accounts of what the ocean does when the ground shakes. That knowledge was sidelined for a long time. The scientific community eventually arrived at the same conclusions through turbidite cores and Japanese tsunami records. The lesson in that history, about whose knowledge gets taken seriously and when, is worth sitting with. The Cascadia Fault will rupture again. The geological record, spanning thousands of years and dozens of events, makes that clear. When it does, it will be one of the most significant natural disasters in North American recorded history. The gap between what we know about this fault and how thoroughly that knowledge has been translated into infrastructure, preparedness, and public awareness remains one of the most consequential gaps in American disaster readiness. Knowing about it is not nothing. Knowing about it is the beginning of something. If this kind of deep dive into the geological forces shaping our world is something you want more of, there's a lot more to explore, from the volcanic systems of the Cascades that sit directly above this same subduction zone, to the fault networks threading beneath Los Angeles that operate on entirely different but equally alarming timelines. Stick around. Subscribe if you want to keep getting pulled into the deep geology of the world we all live on. And if you want to share this somewhere, with someone who lives in Oregon or Washington or British Columbia who maybe hasn't thought about this before, that's not fear-mongering. That's just information moving to where it's needed. Stay curious. Stay informed. And if you live near a coast, know your high ground.